He has five quarterbacks I would bench this week heading into week 15. The first guy's Matt Ryan of the Atlanta Falcons. Ryan, the last few weeks, the numbers have dropped down a lot for him, and he's a guy you just can't rely on now. He's failed to reach 20 fantasy points in a game since week 9, and that's not good production at all. Week 11, he had 5 fantasy points at New Orleans, 232 yards and 2 windows was Ryan. Then week 12 at Vegas, 17.9 fantasy points, 185 yards, 2 touchdowns and an into. Week 13 versus New Orleans, 273, a touchdown and a fumble. And last week in a great matchup versus the Chargers, he only had 224 passing yards, 3 interceptions, and a touchdown. And this week, it's not going to get that much easier. This Tampa Bay defense, they played pretty well against certain quarterbacks. And I think this week in a division matchup, in a game Tampa Bay needs their defense, they're going to tighten up the screws. And Matt Ryan, I think it's another mediocre fantasy game for him. Anywhere from 15 to 18 fantasy points, and that's not really getting the job done. And I can't trust him after the last 4 weeks of putting up bad numbers. So Matt Ryan, he's the first quarterback to bench. The second quarterback you should bench this week's Kirk Cousins of the Minnesota Vikings. Cousins, he's been on a tear the last few weeks. Last week he came back to earth a little though, with only 19 fantasy points at Tampa Bay. This week another tough matchup for him versus the Chicago Bears. This bad defense gives up the 10th least amount of fantasy points to quarterbacks. In his last matchup versus Chicago in Week 10, he had a decent game, 292 passing yards, 2 touchdowns and an into. He finished the day with 21 fantasy points. So Cousins, I think that'll be the most he could get in this week. Chicago, they're pretty sturdy D. They make some plays, and they know what Kirk Cousins is going to do, versing them twice a season every year. And this week, I know the game's indoors, which helps, but Cousins, I just can't trust him in a big playoff game for fantasy this week and a tough matchup. So he's the second quarterback to bench. The third guy's Tua Tagovailoa of the Miami Dolphins. Tua last week with his first career 300-yard game versus the Kansas City Chiefs, and it was a good one for him where he put up 31 fantasy points. But this week he's got a very tough matchup versus the New England Patriots, who pounce on rookie quarterbacks under Bill Belichick and his defensive plan. We've seen this Patriot team shut down Justin Herbert a few weeks ago where he only had 5 fantasy points. And this week, Tua, I don't see him doing much, to be honest. 12 to 15 points at most. This New England defense, they're going to find ways to stop him. You know, Belichick knows how to stop the rookies, like I said. And Tua, he wasn't that great up until last week anyway for fantasy. And this week, you got to bench him, and I wouldn't play him. The fourth quarterback to bench is Matthew Stafford of the Detroit Lions. Stafford, who knows if he's even going to play in this game. And if he is and you have him, I wouldn't play him. He's banged up with ribs, the bad thumb. He missed practice today, so that's not a good sign. And anyway, it was a decent matchup at Tennessee, but last week we saw the injuries and the inconsistency catch up to him, where he only had 244 passing yards and a touchdown versus Green Bay last week. So Stafford, he's banged up, he's injured. Kenny Galladay's hurt as well. Who knows if he's going to play? And he's a guy I would just keep on my bench or possibly drop as well. So he's the fourth quarterback to bench. And the fifth and final quarterback to bench this week, Cam Newton of the New England Patriots. Cam, the fun's over, man. Cam, he's so inconsistent. And the games where he has a bad game, he really has a bad game. And 2 out of his last 3 fantasy games now, he's failed to reach 5 fantasy points in those games. And that's what he did last week at the Rams with 7 carries, 16 yards, and only 119 yards passing in an into. And this week in Miami, I don't think Cam's going to do much. He's been inconsistent. He's tough to trust. And in my opinion, he's an easy bench this week. So that's 5 quarterbacks I would bench here for week 15.